In August 1960, a 41-year-old Soviet military intelligence officer named Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky approached two Western tourists on a Moscow street and attempted to hand them a package containing classified Soviet military documents. The tourists were startled by the approach and hurried away without taking the package. Penkovsky walked quickly in the opposite direction, his heart pounding, uncertain whether he had just made a catastrophic mistake that would lead to his arrest, or whether he would have another opportunity to make contact with Western intelligence services. Penkovsky, a colonel in the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, held the official position of senior officer in the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research Work, a civilian organization that provided cover for GRU officers to travel abroad and interact with foreign scientists and businessmen. He was of medium height, approximately 5 feet 8 inches tall, with dark hair that had begun to gray at the temples, and he carried himself with the disciplined posture of someone who had spent decades in military service. To any observer that August day, he appeared to be an ordinary Soviet official going about routine business in the capital. What no observer could have known was that Penkovsky had spent months attempting to contact American or British intelligence. He possessed detailed knowledge of Soviet strategic capabilities, military planning, and weapons systems that he believed could help prevent nuclear war between the superpowers. His position gave him access to classified information about Soviet missile programs, nuclear weapons development, and military doctrine that Western intelligence services would have found extraordinarily valuable. But making contact with Western intelligence while under the constant surveillance that characterized life in Moscow for Soviet officials with security clearances required careful planning and significant risk. The August 1960 approach to the Western tourists represented one of several failed attempts. Earlier that summer, he had tried to pass a letter to American embassy officials. The letter had not reached its intended recipients. Now, walking away from another failed contact, Penkovsky faced the question of whether to abandon his efforts or to try again with different tactics and different targets. He would try again. And 4 months later, in December 1960, his persistence would finally succeed when he made contact with a British businessman named Greville Wynne, who had connections to British intelligence. That contact would initiate an intelligence operation that would last 17 months, produce some of the most valuable information obtained by Western intelligence during the Cold War, provide crucial intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and ultimately cost Penkovsky his life. But in August 1960, walking away from the frightened tourists on a Moscow street, Oleg Penkovsky was simply a Soviet officer with secrets he believed the world needed to know, trying to find someone who would listen. Before we go further into one of the most consequential intelligence operations of the Cold War, if you're interested in the real documented stories of espionage and the hidden history that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these deeply researched cases every week. Now, let's examine how Oleg Penkovsky became the most valuable Western intelligence asset inside Soviet military intelligence and how his intelligence helped prevent nuclear war. To understand why Oleg Penkovsky was willing to risk his life, his family's future, and everything he had achieved in his military career to provide classified Soviet secrets to Western intelligence, it is necessary to examine the trajectory of his life up to that point and the particular combination of ideological disillusionment, professional frustration, and genuine conviction that led him to make that choice. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky had been born on April 23, 1919, in the Caucasus region of Russia, into a family with a complicated relationship to the revolutionary changes sweeping through Russian society. His father, Vladimir Penkovsky, had been an officer in the White Army. the anti-Bolshevik forces that fought against the Red Army during the Russian Civil War. Vladimir Penkovsky had been killed in 1919 when Oleg was still an infant, fighting against Bolshevik forces in the northern Caucasus. This fact would shadow Oleg throughout his life, creating a permanent vulnerability in his background that Soviet security services could always point to as evidence of potentially unreliable political loyalty. Oleg's mother, Antonina, had remarried to a loyal Communist Party member, and Oleg himself had been raised in an environment that emphasized Soviet patriotism and dedication to building the new socialist society. He had been an exceptional student, particularly in mathematics and languages, and had joined the Komsomol, the Communist Youth Organization, at the appropriate age, demonstrating the expected enthusiasm for Soviet ideology and the energy required to overcome the stain of his father's service to the White cause. In 1937, at age 18, Penkovsky had been accepted into the Kiev Artillery School, a prestigious military educational institution that trained officers for the Soviet armed forces. He had graduated in 1939 with high marks and had been commissioned as an officer in the Soviet artillery forces. During World War II, what Soviet historiography referred to as the Great Patriotic War, Penkovsky had served with distinction on the Eastern Front, participating in several major battles, including the defense of Moscow and operations in Ukraine. He had been wounded twice, received commendations for courage under fire, and emerged from the war as a decorated combat veteran with a legitimate claim to having defended the Soviet motherland. After the war, Penkovsky had continued his military education, attending the Frunze Military Academy and later the Military Diplomatic Academy, where he received advanced training in military intelligence operations, foreign languages, and the specific skills required for intelligence work abroad. He studied English intensively and achieved fluency. He also gained working knowledge of French and German. His academic performance had been excellent, marking him as an officer with potential for significant advancement within Soviet military intelligence. Upon graduation, he had been assigned to the GRU, Glavnoye Razvedivatelnoye Upravlenie, or Main Intelligence Directorate, the Soviet military intelligence service that operated parallel to the KGB but reported directly to the Soviet General Staff rather than to the political leadership. The GRU focused primarily on foreign military intelligence, technical intelligence about weapons systems, and strategic intelligence about the military capabilities and intentions of potential adversaries. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, Penkovsky had advanced through various positions within the GRU. He had served in Turkey from 1955 to 1956, operating under diplomatic cover at the Soviet military attaché's office in Ankara, where his responsibilities had included collecting intelligence on NATO military capabilities and on Turkey's strategic position within the Western Alliance. His work in Turkey had been considered competent, and he had returned to Moscow in 1956 expecting career advancement appropriate to his experience, education, and wartime service. Instead, his career stalled. His advancement was repeatedly blocked by his father's White Army service. Soviet security protocols required extensive background checks for senior positions in military intelligence, and this fact was cited again and again as reason why Penkovsky could not be fully trusted with the most sensitive positions or the highest-level clearances. He watched as officers he considered less capable or less dedicated advanced ahead of him because their backgrounds were politically unimpeachable, their fathers having been loyal Bolsheviks or at least neutral peasants rather than active enemies of the revolution. This professional frustration was compounded by his growing awareness of what he perceived as the fundamental dishonesty and incompetence of Soviet leadership. Working at GRU headquarters in Moscow, Penkovsky had access to internal assessments of Soviet military capabilities that revealed a significant gap between public Soviet claims about military strength and the actual state of Soviet forces. He saw intelligence reports showing that the Soviet Union lagged substantially behind the United States in many areas of military technology, particularly in nuclear warhead miniaturization, missile guidance systems, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bomber capabilities. Yet Soviet propaganda and official statements, including statements by Premier Nikita Khrushchev himself, consistently claimed that the Soviet Union had achieved nuclear parity or even superiority over the United States. Khrushchev had boasted publicly about Soviet factories producing missiles like sausages, suggesting vast numbers of intercontinental ballistic missiles aimed at American cities. Penkovsky knew these claims were false. He had seen the production figures. He had read the technical assessments describing the difficulties Soviet engineers faced in developing reliable guidance systems and in miniaturizing nuclear warheads sufficiently to fit on missile platforms. What disturbed Penkovsky most was his realization that this dishonesty was not merely for external propaganda purposes, but had infected internal Soviet planning. He attended meetings where senior military officials discussed strategic scenarios based more on ideological assumptions about capitalist weakness and socialist superiority than on accurate analysis of the actual balance of forces. He saw war plans that assumed Soviet military capabilities that did not yet exist. He heard discussions of preemptive nuclear strikes against the United States and Western Europe that treated millions of deaths as acceptable costs in pursuit of ideological victory. His exposure to Western culture during his time in Turkey and through his work with foreign delegations in Moscow had also affected his worldview. He had observed that ordinary people in Western countries lived materially better lives than their Soviet counterparts. He had seen that Western societies, while certainly not perfect, offered personal freedoms and opportunities that did not exist in the Soviet Union. The stores had more goods, the people seemed less fearful, there was debate and disagreement that did not result in arrest. These observations contradicted the Soviet ideological narrative that capitalism was a system of exploitation and misery, while socialism provided a superior quality of life for workers. But the most significant factor in Penkovsky's decision was his genuine fear of nuclear war. He had access to Soviet military planning documents that discussed scenarios for preemptive nuclear strikes. He had seen calculations about acceptable casualty levels in nuclear exchanges. He had attended briefings where senior officials discussed nuclear war in abstract clinical terms, as if tens of millions of deaths were merely statistical problems to be optimized through proper targeting and timing. Penkovsky came to believe that some elements of the Soviet leadership were willing to risk nuclear conflict based on fundamental miscalculations about Western intentions and capabilities. He believed that if Soviet leaders thought they had achieved strategic superiority, or if they believed the Americans thought the Soviets had achieved superiority, they might take aggressive actions that could escalate to nuclear war. Conversely, if Western leaders overestimated Soviet capabilities, they might respond to Soviet provocations with excessive force, also leading to escalation. The combination of professional frustration, ideological disillusionment, exposure to Western alternatives, and fear of nuclear catastrophe led Penkovsky to make what he would later describe as the most important decision of his life: that he would attempt to provide information to Western intelligence services that might help prevent nuclear war by giving Western leaders accurate rather than distorted information about Soviet capabilities and intentions. His initial attempts to make contact had all failed for various reasons. The August 1960 approach to tourists on a Moscow street had failed because the targets were frightened. Then earlier attempts to pass messages through intermediaries had failed because those intermediaries either did not deliver the messages or delivered them to people who did not know what to do with them. Each failed attempt increased Penkovsky's anxiety that he would be detected before he could establish a productive relationship with Western intelligence. The successful contact came in December 1960, when Penkovsky met Greville Wynne at a reception in Moscow for foreign businessmen and Soviet officials involved in scientific and technical exchanges. Wynne, 41 years old, was officially the managing director of a British electrical engineering company that facilitated trade between British manufacturers and Soviet industrial organizations. His actual relationship with MI6, the British Secret Intelligence Service, was as an occasional contact who provided cover and assistance for intelligence operations when his business travel took him to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Penkovsky had observed Wynne at several previous receptions and had made the assessment that Wynne had connections to British intelligence. At the December reception, Penkovsky approached Wynne and struck up a conversation about potential business collaboration. During the conversation, Penkovsky managed to signal his interest in providing information to British intelligence. According to later accounts from both participants, the exchange was brief and ambiguous enough to appear innocent to any Soviet security personnel who might have been monitoring the reception, but clear enough that Wynne understood what was being offered. Wynne reported the contact to his MI6 handlers in London. The initial response was cautious. Western intelligence services had learned from experience that Soviet intelligence occasionally dangled volunteers who were actually controlled by the KGB, designed to identify Western intelligence officers or to feed disinformation. Penkovsky would need to be carefully assessed before any operational relationship could be established. The assessment process took several months. MI6 conducted background research on Penkovsky, examining what could be learned about his position, his access, his personal history, and his motivations. The preliminary assessment was that he appeared to be genuine, a Soviet officer with legitimate access to valuable information who had become disillusioned for understandable reasons, but verification would require face-to-face meetings where he could be questioned extensively and where the quality of his information could be evaluated. The opportunity for such meetings came in April 1961, when Penkovsky was selected to accompany a Soviet trade delegation to Britain. The delegation was scheduled to spend 2 weeks in London negotiating technical cooperation agreements in various scientific fields, and Penkovsky's official role was to provide expertise on scientific and technical matters related to potential areas of collaboration. Penkovsky arrived in London on April 20, 1961, staying at a hotel in central London along with other members of the Soviet delegation. British counterintelligence services, alerted by MI6 that Penkovsky was a potential asset who might attempt to make contact during his visit, maintained discreet surveillance on the Soviet delegation while ensuring that Penkovsky would have opportunities to separate from his colleagues without drawing undue suspicion. During his time in London, Penkovsky attended several meetings with Western intelligence officers at safe houses in the city. Because Penkovsky's information was primarily about Soviet strategic capabilities, missile programs, nuclear weapons, military doctrine, the CIA was brought into the operation as the primary consumer and handler of Penkovsky's intelligence, with MI6 providing logistical support and certain operational capabilities based on their presence in Moscow. The debriefing sessions in London were conducted by a joint team of CIA and MI6 officers. The CIA was represented by officers including George Kiesewetter, a Russian-speaking case officer with extensive experience running Soviet sources. The MI6 was represented by officers including Harold Shergold, The debriefings typically lasted several hours, during which Penkovsky provided verbal information and handed over documents and photographs he had brought with him from Moscow. CIA and MI6 officers quickly assessed Penkovsky's value. He provided detailed technical information about Soviet missile programs, including the R-12 Divina medium-range ballistic missile known to NATO as the SS-4 Sandal, and the R-14 Chusovaya intermediate-range ballistic missile known as the SS-5 Skeen. He described the technical specifications of these missiles, their range capabilities, their accuracy limitations, and the procedures for deploying them in the field. He provided organizational charts showing the structure of the Soviet strategic rocket forces, the command relationships within Soviet military leadership, and the identities of key personnel involved in strategic weapons programs. Perhaps most significantly for Western intelligence analysis, Penkovsky provided information that helped resolve the missile gap debate that had dominated American strategic thinking since the late 1950s. Following the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957, American politicians and military planners had engaged in intense debate about whether the Soviet Union had achieved numerical superiority in intercontinental ballistic missiles compared to the United States. The missile gap had been a major issue in the 1960 presidential campaign, with candidate John F. Kennedy arguing that the Eisenhower administration had allowed the Soviets to gain a dangerous advantage. Penkovsky's information indicated that Soviet ICBM capabilities were far more limited than the highest Western estimates had suggested. According to the technical and operational data he provided, the Soviet Union had encountered significant difficulties in producing reliable intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Soviet ICBM program had struggled with guidance systems that lacked the accuracy needed for military effectiveness, with engines that were unreliable and with the technical challenges of miniaturizing nuclear warheads sufficiently to fit on long-range missiles. As a result, the Soviets had deployed far fewer operational ICBMs than Soviet propaganda had claimed, and far fewer than some Western analysts had feared. This information, once verified through other intelligence sources including satellite reconnaissance and signals intelligence, would significantly influence American strategic planning. It helped to reduce the sense of panic that had been driving calls for massive expansion of American missile programs and allowed for more measured responses to Soviet strategic posturing. During the London debriefings, CIA and MI6 officers also worked with Penkovsky to establish secure communication protocols for ongoing intelligence collection once he returned to Moscow. They provided him with a Minox camera, a small, sophisticated device designed for photographing documents. The Minox B, which Penkovsky received, was approximately 4 inches long and could produce high-quality photographs of documents in various lighting conditions. Officers trained Penkovsky extensively in its use, teaching him techniques for photographing documents quickly and in challenging conditions, for concealing the camera, and for developing a workflow that would minimize the time classified documents were in his possession outside of secure facilities. They established dead drop locations in Moscow, where Penkovsky could leave packages of exposed film to be collected by Western intelligence officers. A dead drop is a location where materials can be left by one person and retrieved by another without the two people meeting directly, reducing the risk of both parties being observed together. The Moscow dead drops included locations in parks, near monuments, and in other public spaces that Penkovsky could plausibly visit as part of his normal routine. They created signal systems that Penkovsky could use to indicate when he had material ready for collection or when he needed emergency contact. These signals involved simple actions that would appear innocent to observers, making a telephone call at a specific time to a specific number and letting it ring a certain number of times, and making a chalk mark in a particular location, wearing certain clothing when walking past designated observation points. Critical to the operation's success in Moscow would be the work of Janet Chisholm, the wife of MI6 officer Rory Chisholm, who was stationed at the British Embassy in Moscow under diplomatic cover as a visa officer. Janet Chisholm was not an intelligence officer herself, but served as what intelligence professionals call an agent handler operating under non-official cover. As a diplomat's wife, she could move around Moscow with somewhat less surveillance than intelligence officers operating under official cover at the embassy. Soviet counterintelligence maintained surveillance on diplomats' families, but the surveillance was generally less intensive than that directed at known or suspected intelligence officers. Janet Chisholm would meet Penkovsky in parks and other public locations, often with her children present to make the meetings appear to be chance encounters. She would accept packages from Penkovsky containing exposed Minox film, quickly concealing the packages in her handbag or in her children's stroller. These meetings, though they appeared casual, were carefully choreographed and timed to minimize exposure. Penkovsky would approach while appearing to be simply another parent with children in the park. Brief conversation might be exchanged, comments about the weather, about the children, nothing substantive. The package would be passed, the encounter would end. Both parties would leave separately. The security protocols emphasized that Penkovsky should avoid any behavior that might attract attention from Soviet counterintelligence. He was instructed to photograph only documents he could access as part of his normal work duties, to never remove documents from secure facilities for extended periods, to maintain his regular routine and professional relationships without any changes that might suggest he had been recruited by foreign intelligence, and to exercise extreme caution in all operational activities. Penkovsky returned to Moscow in early May 1961. Over the following 17 months, he would conduct one of the most productive espionage operations in Cold War history. The material Penkovsky provided fell into several categories, each valuable for different analytical purposes. First, there were technical specifications for Soviet weapons systems. Penkovsky photographed manuals describing missile guidance systems, in showing the mathematical algorithms used to calculate trajectories and the mechanical systems used to execute course corrections. He photographed documents describing nuclear warhead designs, including yield calculations, detonation mechanisms, and the materials used in warhead construction. He photographed radar system specifications showing detection ranges, resolution capabilities, and vulnerabilities to countermeasures. He photographed military communications equipment specifications revealing encryption methods and transmission protocols. Second, there were operational documents describing Soviet military planning. Penkovsky photographed war plans outlining scenarios for military conflict with NATO, including plans for conventional warfare in Europe and plans for nuclear strikes against Western military and civilian targets. He photographed mobilization procedures showing how Soviet forces would be assembled and deployed in crisis situations. He photographed readiness assessments, evaluating Soviet military preparedness for various conflict scenarios, often revealing significant deficiencies in equipment, training, and logistics. Third, there were organizational documents showing the structure of Soviet military and intelligence organizations. Penkovsky photographed organization charts showing command relationships within the Soviet Ministry of Defense, the Strategic Rocket Forces, and the GRU itself. He photographed personnel rosters identifying key officials, their positions, their responsibilities, and their backgrounds. He photographed documents describing the relationships between military organizations and political leadership, revealing how decisions were made and who wielded actual power. Between May 1961 and October 1962, Penkovsky photographed more than 5,000 frames of classified Soviet documents. He used the Minox camera to photograph documents in his office during lunch breaks or after normal working hours when fewer colleagues were present. He photographed documents at home after bringing them from work in his briefcase, though this practice violated his instructions to minimize the time classified materials were outside secure facilities. He established a workflow that allowed him to photograph dozens of pages in a single session, working quickly and methodically to minimize risk. He passed the exposed film to Janet Chisholm and other Western intelligence contacts through dead drops and through brief meetings in public locations. The film was then smuggled out of the Soviet Union through diplomatic pouches or through couriers with diplomatic immunity sent to London and Washington for processing and analysis. The intelligence Penkovsky provided was valuable not only for its substance, but for its sourcing. Because Penkovsky had direct access to classified documents in his work at the State Committee for the Coordination of Scientific Research Work, and because he maintained friendships and professional relationships with officers at GRU headquarters, he could obtain information that would have been extremely difficult for Western intelligence to acquire through other means. The documents he photographed often bore classification markings, date stamps, official seals, and other indicators that allowed CIA and MI6 analysts to assess their authenticity, their currency, and their place within the broader corpus of Soviet military documentation. Throughout 1961 and into 1962, Penkovsky also traveled abroad several more times with Soviet trade and technical delegations. He traveled to Paris in September 1961, where he met with CIA and MI6 officers at safe houses and provided additional documents and debriefing information. He traveled to London again in July 1962 for further meetings. These trips abroad allowed for more extensive debriefings than were possible through the constrained communication methods available in Moscow, and they allowed Western intelligence officers to ask Penkovsky specific questions about documents he had provided or about issues that had arisen in analysis of his intelligence. During this period, Tsaren and geopolitical tensions between the Soviet Union and the West were escalating along multiple fronts. In June 1961, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had met with newly elected U.S. President John F. Kennedy in Vienna and had issued an ultimatum regarding the status of Berlin. Khrushchev threatened to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany that would terminate Western access rights to West Berlin, effectively allowing the East German government to control access to the city, and potentially forcing Western powers to either abandon West Berlin or to use military force to maintain their position. In August 1961, in response to the continuing flow of East Germans fleeing to the West through Berlin, East German authorities, with Soviet approval, began construction of the Berlin Wall, physically dividing the city and preventing further emigration from east to west. The wall became the most visible symbol of the division of Europe and of the fundamental ideological conflict between communist and democratic systems. During this period, information from Penkovsky helped Western policymakers understand Soviet decision-making regarding Berlin. His reports indicated that while Soviet rhetoric was aggressive and while Khrushchev's ultimatums suggested willingness to risk war, internal Soviet military assessments showed significant concern about the risks of escalation to military conflict. Soviet military planners were acutely aware that NATO conventional forces in Europe were substantial and that the United States possessed overwhelming nuclear superiority. The assessments Penkovsky provided suggested that Soviet military leadership was far more cautious about Berlin than Khrushchev's public statements suggested, and that Soviet planning focused more on achieving political objectives through pressure and intimidation than on actual preparation for war. This intelligence helped American and British officials calibrate their responses to Soviet threats over Berlin. They maintained firm positions on Western rights in Berlin while avoiding provocative military movements that might be interpreted as preparation for offensive action. They communicated clearly to Soviet leadership that Western access rights to Berlin were not negotiable, while also signaling that the West had no intention of using the Berlin situation as a pretext for attacking East Germany or the Soviet Union. The crisis over Berlin gradually subsided without military confrontation, though the wall would stand for nearly 3 decades as a monument to division. The intelligence Penkovsky provided became even more critical in October 1962, during what would become known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the moment when the Cold War came closest to nuclear war. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying at high altitude over Cuba photographed what appeared to be Soviet medium-range ballistic missile sites under construction in the Cuban countryside. The photographs, analyzed by CIA photo interpreters, showed missiles on transporters, launch equipment being assembled, and construction of facilities consistent with ballistic missile deployments. The photographs triggered an immediate crisis in Washington. President Kennedy convened a group of senior advisors known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or EXCOM, to determine how to respond to Soviet deployment of nuclear-capable missiles just 90 miles from American territory. The EXCOM included Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, CIA, Director John McCone, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Maxwell Taylor, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and other senior officials. The crisis presented several urgent intelligence questions. What types of missiles were being deployed? What was their range and destructive capability? How quickly could they become operational? What were Soviet intentions? Had the Soviet Union deployed nuclear warheads to Cuba, or only the missiles themselves? Would the Soviet Union actually use nuclear weapons, if confronted by American military action, to remove the missiles? Information from Penkovsky proved crucial in answering several of these questions. Based on the technical specifications he had provided for Soviet medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, CIA analysts were able to identify with high confidence the specific missile types visible in the U-2 photographs. The missiles were R-12 Dvina missiles, designated by NATO as SS-4 Sandal medium-range ballistic missiles. Penkovsky had provided detailed technical manuals for the SS-4, including specifications showing that the missile had a range of approximately 1,200 miles when armed with a nuclear warhead, sufficient to reach much of the southeastern United States, including Washington when launched from Cuba. The manuals Penkovsky had provided also included information about deployment procedures and timelines. Based on this information, CIA analysts could assess how far the construction visible in the U-2 photographs had progressed and could estimate how long it would be before the missiles could become operational. The assessment was that the Soviets were moving rapidly, but that the missiles were not yet ready to launch, providing a window of time for American decision-making before the missiles became an immediate operational threat. Additionally, Penkovsky's broader intelligence about Soviet strategic thinking and military doctrine provided context for assessing how Soviet leaders might respond to different American actions. His reports had indicated that Soviet military planners were acutely aware of American nuclear superiority, despite public Soviet claims of parity or superiority, and were deeply concerned about the vulnerability of Soviet strategic forces to American preemptive strikes. Soviet military doctrine emphasized the importance of avoiding direct military confrontation with the United States when Soviet strategic forces were at a significant disadvantage. This intelligence suggested that despite aggressive Soviet rhetoric and despite the provocative deployment of missiles to Cuba, Soviet leaders were unlikely to risk direct military confrontation with the United States if presented with clear evidence of American determination and military readiness. The intelligence helped American officials understand that the missile deployment to Cuba was likely intended to achieve political objectives, demonstrating Soviet support for Cuba, compensating for Soviet strategic inferiority, pressuring the United States on Berlin, rather than as preparation for an actual nuclear attack on the United States. The ExComm deliberated from October 16th to 28th, debating responses from diplomatic pressure to military action. The intelligence about specific missile types, their capabilities, their deployment status, and Soviet strategic thinking influenced deliberations by allowing precise military planning, informing threat timeline assessments, and providing context for understanding Soviet motivations and likely responses. President Kennedy ultimately decided on a naval blockade, termed a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of the word blockade during peacetime. On October 22, 1962, Kennedy delivered a televised address to the American people informing them of the Soviet missile deployments in Cuba and announcing that the United States was imposing a quarantine on Cuba to prevent further shipment of offensive weapons. He demanded that the Soviet Union remove the missiles already deployed and warned that any missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring full retaliatory response. The world held its breath. Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment were sailing toward Cuba. American naval vessels had been deployed to enforce the quarantine. American military forces around the world had been placed on high alert. Strategic bombers carrying nuclear weapons were in the air on continuous patrol. Missile crews at intercontinental ballistic missile sites in the American Midwest were at their launch consoles. Soviet strategic forces had similarly been placed on alert. Behind the scenes, intensive diplomatic negotiations were underway. The Kennedy administration communicated directly with Soviet leadership through official diplomatic channels and through informal back channels. The Americans made clear that the missiles must be removed and that the United States was prepared to use military force, if necessary, to achieve that objective. The Soviets sought assurances that the United States would not invade Cuba and sought to link the Cuba situation to other issues, including American missile deployments in Turkey. On October 28, 1962, after 6 days during which nuclear war seemed more likely than at any other time in human history, Soviet Premier Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the United States publicly pledged not to invade Cuba. Additionally, through secret diplomatic communications, the United States agreed to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, though this agreement was not made public and the Turkish missiles were not removed until several months later. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis represented one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the Cold War era, pulling the world back from the brink of nuclear catastrophe. While many factors contributed to the peaceful resolution, including the skill of American and Soviet diplomats, the personal judgment of Kennedy and Khrushchev, and the effectiveness of communication through the crisis, the intelligence provided by Oleg Penkovsky played a significant role in enabling informed decision-making on the American side. Oleg Penkovsky did not live to see the full resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. His operation had already been compromised, According to later accounts from Soviet sources and from Western intelligence analysis, Soviet counterintelligence had become suspicious of Penkovsky by the summer of 1962. The precise sequence of events that led to this suspicion remains partially unclear even decades later, but several factors appear to have contributed. First, there was the inherent accumulation of risk in any espionage operation conducted over an extended period. Despite careful planning, extensive training, and sophisticated tradecraft, every operational act, every dead drop, every meeting with Janet Chisholm, every removal of classified documents from secure facilities, every photograph taken with the Minox camera, created potential indicators that could be detected through surveillance, through document tracking systems, through the observations of colleagues, or through analysis of patterns. Soviet counterintelligence was sophisticated and pervasive. The KGB's Second Chief Directorate, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence, maintained extensive surveillance on foreign diplomats and on Soviet citizens who had contact with foreigners. The GRU had its own counterintelligence personnel who monitored the activities of GRU officers. Every Soviet official with access to classified information was subject to periodic security reviews examining their behavior, their contacts, their financial situation, and any anomalies that might suggest compromise. Second, there is evidence suggesting that Soviet intelligence may have received information about Western intelligence activities in Moscow from a penetration of Western intelligence services or from Soviet double agents. While the specific source has never been definitively established, Soviet counterintelligence appeared to have information that suggested Western intelligence was running a highly productive source with access to Soviet military secrets. Third, there were operational security failures. Penkovsky had been instructed to photograph only documents he could access through his normal work duties and to avoid removing classified materials from secure facilities for extended periods. However, the volume of material he photographed, more than 5,000 frames over 17 months, suggests he may have been taking risks beyond those his handlers had authorized. On October 22, 1962, the same day that President Kennedy delivered his televised address to the American people announcing the discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba and the imposition of the naval quarantine, KGB officers arrested Oleg Penkovsky at his Moscow apartment. KGB officers conducted the arrest with characteristic Soviet efficiency. They arrived at approximately 6:30 in the morning before Penkovsky would have left for work. They presented an arrest warrant signed by appropriate legal authorities. They searched the apartment extensively, going through closets, drawers, personal papers, and every conceivable hiding place. They discovered the Minox camera concealed in a bookshelf. They found unexposed Minox film cartridges. They found materials for communicating with Western intelligence, and including one-time pads for encoding messages and instructions for using dead drop locations. They found currency including American dollars, which Soviet citizens were not permitted to possess. Penkovsky's wife, Vera, and their 2 daughters were present during the arrest. According to later accounts from people who knew the family, Vera was completely bewildered by what was happening. She asked repeatedly what her husband was being accused of, insisting there must be some mistake. The daughters, awakened by the commotion, came from their bedroom to find KGB officers searching the apartment and their father being questioned and then taken into custody. Both would later describe this moment as the most traumatic experience of their lives. Penkovsky was transported to Lubyanka prison, the headquarters of the KGB in central Moscow, and a building that had served as the center of Soviet state security operations since the early days of the Bolshevik regime. He was placed in isolation in a cell in the prison's internal detention facility and interrogated over the following weeks and months. Soviet interrogation techniques in espionage cases typically combined periods of intensive questioning with periods of isolation designed to break down psychological resistance. Interrogators presented evidence of guilt. The physical materials found in his apartment, surveillance photographs showing his contacts with Janet Chisholm and other Western intelligence contacts, testimony from Soviet citizens who had observed his activities, and analysis of his document access patterns showing irregularities consistent with espionage. They offered possibilities for cooperation, suggesting that full confession might result in leniency or might at least spare his family from the worst consequences. They alternated between aggressive confrontation and sympathetic understanding, trying to establish rapport and to encourage confession. According to documents that became available after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Penkovsky initially denied the charges, but eventually provided detailed confessions describing his recruitment by Western intelligence, the information he had provided, and his motivations for committing espionage. The confessions describe his meetings with Western intelligence officers, his training in the use of the Minox camera and in communications protocols, the documents he photographed, and his understanding of how his intelligence was being used. Greville Wynne, the British businessman who had served as Penkovsky's initial contact and who had continued to facilitate communications between Penkovsky and Western intelligence, was arrested by Hungarian security services in Budapest on November 2, 1962. Wynne had traveled to Budapest on what was ostensibly a business trip, apparently unaware that his connection to Penkovsky had been discovered and that Soviet intelligence had requested his detention. Hungarian security services, operating on behalf of the KGB under the mutual assistance agreements that bound Warsaw Pact intelligence services, detained Wynne at his hotel and transported him to Moscow. He was held at Lubyanka prison in a cell near Penkovsky's and interrogated about his role in the operation. Unlike Penkovsky, Wynne was a British citizen arrested on foreign territory, all creating diplomatic complications. The Soviet government eventually charged him with espionage and announced that he would be tried alongside Penkovsky in a public trial. The public trial of Oleg Penkovsky and Greville Wynne began on May 7, 1963, in Moscow, conducted in the Hall of Columns of the House of Unions, a grand neoclassical building in central Moscow that had been used for major show trials during the Stalin era. The trial was open to selected members of the public, to Soviet and foreign journalists, and to diplomatic observers. It was conducted according to Soviet legal procedures for cases involving state security, which meant that while there was formal court process with prosecutors, defense attorneys, witnesses, and testimony, the outcome had been predetermined by the Soviet government. The trial served multiple purposes for Soviet authorities. It presented evidence of Western espionage operations against the Soviet Union, demonstrating to the Soviet public and to the world that Western intelligence services were actively attempting to steal Soviet secrets. It demonstrated the effectiveness of Soviet security organs in detecting and stopping such operations, reinforcing public confidence in state security. It provided an opportunity to expose details of Western intelligence methods and operations, and it justified the severe punishments that would be imposed on Penkovsky and Wynne. During the 4-day trial, prosecutors presented extensive evidence, including the materials found in Penkovsky's apartment, surveillance photographs showing Penkovsky's contacts with Janet Chisholm and other Western intelligence officers, the excerpts from Penkovsky's confession describing his recruitment and his espionage activities, and testimony from Soviet officials who had worked with Penkovsky and who described his access to classified information. The prosecution argued that Penkovsky had betrayed his country, violated his oath as a Soviet officer, and provided classified information to enemy intelligence services that had damaged Soviet national security. They characterized his motivations as a combination of financial greed, pointing to the currency found in his apartment, and personal resentment over his career frustrations. They described him as a traitor who had sold out his country for Western money and for the psychological satisfaction of feeling important to foreign intelligence services. Penkovsky's defense attorney, operating within the severe constraints of the Soviet legal system, could not effectively challenge the evidence of guilt or argue that Penkovsky's actions were justified. The attorney could only attempt to argue for consideration of mitigating factors: Penkovsky's wartime service, his family situation, his cooperation with investigators. But in the Soviet system during this period, espionage on behalf of Western intelligence was considered one of the most serious possible crimes, and there were no meaningful mitigating factors that would influence the predetermined outcome. Wynne was defended by a Soviet attorney who argued that Wynne had been manipulated by British intelligence, that he had not fully understood the significance of what he was doing, and that he deserved leniency as a foreigner who had not betrayed his own country, but had simply served as a courier for British intelligence operations. On May 11, 1963, after a trial that lasted 4 days, the court announced its verdict. Oleg Penkovsky was found guilty of treason and espionage against the Soviet state and was sentenced to death by firing squad. Greville Wynne was found guilty of espionage and was sentenced to 8 years imprisonment, 3 years in prison, and 5 years in a labor camp. According to official Soviet records, a Soviet firing squad executed Oleg Penkovsky on May 16, 1963. 5 days after his conviction. He was 44 years old. The execution was reportedly carried out at Lubyanka prison. His body was cremated, and his family was not permitted to recover his remains or to hold any public memorial service. His name was erased from official records, his military decorations were revoked, and all traces of his career and accomplishments were removed from Soviet archives. However, some accounts from former Soviet officials and from Western intelligence sources have suggested that the official execution date may not be accurate. Some sources have claimed that Penkovsky may have been executed earlier, possibly shortly after his arrest in October 1962, and that the trial was conducted for propaganda purposes even though the defendant was already dead. Other accounts have suggested alternative execution methods. Without access to complete Soviet records, the exact circumstances and timing of Penkovsky's death cannot be verified with absolute certainty. What is certain is that the Soviet state killed Oleg Penkovsky for providing classified information to Western intelligence services, and that his death represented the ultimate price for his decision to commit espionage. The consequences for Penkovsky's family were severe and enduring. Vera Penkovsky, his wife, was not charged with any crime. Soviet authorities concluded, or at least publicly claimed, that she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities. According to later accounts from people who knew the family, Vera genuinely appeared to have been unaware of what her husband was doing. He had never discussed his intelligence work with her in any detail beyond vague references to his official duties. He had concealed his espionage activities carefully, conducting his operational work when she was not present and maintaining his normal routine at home. However, while Vera was not criminally charged, she faced immediate and devastating social and professional consequences. She lost her job as a schoolteacher within days of her husband's arrest. Soviet institutions did not employ the wives of convicted traitors. She and her daughters were forced to move from their apartment to significantly inferior housing in a less desirable area of Moscow. They were subjected to harassment and social ostracism. Neighbors who had been friendly before the arrest now avoided them or made hostile comments. The daughters faced cruelty at school from other students who had been informed by their parents about what Oleg Penkovsky had done. The daughters, who had been 16 and 13 years old at the time of their father's arrest, faced difficulties continuing their education and were barred from certain educational and professional opportunities because of their father's conviction as a traitor. In Soviet society, where family background was scrutinized in security clearances and in admission to prestigious universities and professions, being the daughter of an executed spy was a permanent stain that affected every aspect of life. According to accounts from people who knew the family in subsequent years, Vera Penkovsky spent the remainder of her life struggling to understand her husband's choices and to reconcile her memories of him as a husband and father with the reality of his espionage. She maintained to relatives and to the few friends who remained in contact that she believed Oleg had been motivated by principle rather than by greed or malice, though this belief provided little comfort given the consequences his choices had brought upon the family. She died in later years, having lived for decades with the stigma and the grief. The daughters grew up under the shadow of their father's treason, eventually married and had families of their own, but lived quietly and avoided any public discussion of their father or his case. Greville Wynne served 3 years of his 8-year sentence in Soviet prisons and labor camps, enduring harsh conditions that damaged his health. In April 1964, he was exchanged for Soviet intelligence officer Konon Molody, who had been arrested in Britain in 1961 while operating under the alias Gordon Lonsdale. The exchange took place at the Heerstrasse checkpoint in Berlin, a location that would be used for several Cold War spy exchanges. Wynne returned to Britain in poor health, suffering from the effects of imprisonment, including malnutrition and various medical conditions that had gone untreated during his captivity. He struggled to readjust to normal life. His marriage ended in divorce. He attempted several business ventures, but his reputation had been damaged, and his health problems made sustained work difficult. He dealt with alcoholism and with psychological trauma from his imprisonment. In subsequent years, Wynne wrote memoirs describing his arrest, imprisonment, and trial, presenting himself as a British patriot who had risked his life for his country. He gave lectures and interviews about his experiences. However, some elements of his accounts have been questioned by historians and intelligence professionals who have suggested that Wynne may have exaggerated certain aspects of his role in the Penkovsky operation, perhaps to justify the suffering he had endured or to make his story more commercially viable. Wynne died in 1990 at the age of 70, having spent the last decades of his life dealing with the physical and psychological consequences of his imprisonment and with the challenge of rebuilding a life that had been disrupted by his involvement in espionage. The CIA and MI6 assessed the intelligence value of the Penkovsky operation in classified reports prepared after his arrest and trial. These assessments, portions of which were declassified in subsequent decades, concluded that Penkovsky had provided some of the most valuable intelligence obtained from any human source during the Cold War. A CIA internal history of the Penkovsky case stated that his reporting had fundamentally altered Western understanding of Soviet strategic capabilities and intentions, and had provided information that contributed to preventing nuclear conflict during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The history acknowledged that Penkovsky had paid with his life for providing this information, and noted that his sacrifice represented both the highest form of intelligence cooperation and the tragic human cost of espionage operations. The technical information about Soviet weapons systems that Penkovsky provided allowed Western military planners to understand Soviet capabilities more accurately and to develop appropriate countermeasures and strategies. The insights into Soviet military thinking and strategic planning helped Western policymakers anticipate Soviet actions and responses in crisis situations. The specific intelligence about Soviet missile deployments and capabilities proved invaluable during the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. In the decades after Penkovsky's execution, details of his case gradually became public. In the immediate aftermath of his arrest and trial, both Western intelligence services and Soviet authorities had reasons to control information about the case. The CIA and MI6 wanted to protect intelligence sources and methods, and to avoid disclosing the full extent of what Penkovsky had provided, and to protect other operations that might be compromised by public disclosure. Soviet authorities wanted to control the narrative about Western espionage and about Soviet counterintelligence capabilities. As Cold War tensions gradually eased and as the Soviet Union eventually collapsed, more information became available. In the 1990s, Russian archives were partially opened, providing access to some KGB files related to the case. American and British intelligence agencies declassified portions of their records related to Penkovsky's debriefings and to the intelligence products derived from his reporting. These historical materials have allowed for more detailed reconstruction of Penkovsky's operation and more nuanced assessment of its significance. The researchers have been able to examine the actual documents Penkovsky provided, to read transcripts of his debriefing sessions, and to trace how his intelligence was used in policy decisions. The historical consensus that has emerged is that Penkovsky provided intelligence of genuine and significant value, that his motivations included sincere concern about nuclear war alongside other factors, and that his execution represented the harsh reality of espionage consequences in the Soviet system. For intelligence professionals, the Penkovsky case has served as both an example of successful human intelligence collection and a cautionary tale about operational security and the risks inherent in espionage. His recruitment demonstrated the value of identifying individuals with access to critical information who are motivated to provide that information for reasons of conscience or conviction. His productivity over 17 months showed what could be accomplished when such an asset was properly tasked, supported, and protected. His arrest and execution underscored the extreme risks of intelligence work in closed societies and the moral responsibility that intelligence services bear toward the individuals who work with them, often at the cost of their lives. The case also highlighted the specific challenges of conducting intelligence operations in the Soviet Union, where counterintelligence surveillance was pervasive, where the penalties for espionage were severe, and where the political system created constant pressures and risks for anyone who deviated from expected behavior. The operational tradecraft required to support an asset like Penkovsky while minimizing detection risks was sophisticated and resource-intensive, requiring extensive planning, multiple support officers, secure communications systems, and carefully maintained cover activities. The memorial to Oleg Penkovsky exists not in physical form, but in the historical record of what he did and what he sacrificed. His name appears in histories of Cold War intelligence. Declassified documents describe his contributions to Western understanding of Soviet capabilities. Former intelligence officers who worked with him or who studied his case have written about his courage and his commitment to preventing nuclear war. For Vera and her daughters, decades of suffering brought no comfort from later historical recognition of Oleg's contributions. There is a particular cruelty in the situation Penkovsky's family faced. They suffered consequences for actions they knew nothing about, motivated by convictions they may not have shared in service of outcomes they could not have influenced. Vera lost her husband, her social position, her livelihood, and her sense of security. The daughters lost their father, their educational opportunities, and the futures they had imagined. These losses were not chosen by them, but were imposed as consequences of choices made by Oleg Penkovsky in circumstances his family did not understand. This represents one of the deepest moral problems in espionage, that the consequences are borne not solely by the intelligence officers who conduct operations or by the assets who provide information, but by families and communities who are drawn into consequences without knowledge or consent. The broader question raised by the Penkovsky case concerns the ethics and consequences of espionage in the context of great power competition. From one perspective, Penkovsky was a hero who risked and ultimately sacrificed his life to provide information that helped prevent nuclear war. His intelligence gave Western leaders crucial insights into Soviet capabilities and intentions at moments when such information was literally a matter of survival for millions. If his reporting contributed even marginally to the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, then his sacrifice arguably served a greater good. From another perspective, Penkovsky was a traitor who violated oaths of loyalty, betrayed colleagues and country, and caused enormous harm to his family. His wife and daughters bore consequences they did not deserve and could not have anticipated. His execution, while fitting legal definitions of treason under Soviet law, represented the loss of a human life and the destruction of a family. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Penkovsky's case demonstrates the tragic dimensions of Cold War espionage, the ways in which ideological competition between great powers created situations where individuals faced impossible choices, with consequences rippling far beyond their own lives. Penkovsky chose to commit espionage because he believed it was right, given the information he possessed and the historical moment he inhabited. That choice led to his execution and to lasting harm to his family. Whether that sacrifice was worthwhile depends on assessments of consequences that cannot be precisely measured, and on moral frameworks about which reasonable people disagree. What can be stated with certainty is that the Penkovsky operation represented one of the most significant intelligence successes of the Cold War, that the information he provided influenced Western policy at critical junctures, and that he paid with his life for making that information available. The technical information that Penkovsky provided to Western intelligence between 1961 and 1962 became partially obsolete within a decade as weapons technologies advanced and as new systems replaced the missiles and equipment he had documented. The CIA's damage assessment concluded that Penkovsky's espionage had provided information of extraordinary value for understanding Soviet strategic capabilities. Whether his intelligence actually prevented nuclear war or simply contributed to better-informed decision-making during crisis is impossible to determine with certainty. Intelligence operations by their nature involve accumulation of many small pieces of information that are assembled into larger pictures by analysts and planners. It is possible that information from Penkovsky influenced Soviet military planning after his operation was discovered and his materials were recovered, as Soviet planners would have known that their capabilities and intentions had been exposed to Western intelligence. It is possible that the information helped shape American and NATO military planning in ways that affected the strategic balance and the course of the arms race. It is certain that his intelligence about Soviet missiles contributed to American decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oleg Vladimirovich Penkovsky was born on April 23, 1919, in the Caucasus region of a country that would become the Soviet Union. He was executed on May 16, 1963, in Moscow, for providing classified information to the enemies of his state. Between his birth and his death, he served his country in war and in peace, built a career in military intelligence, raised a family, and made a choice to commit espionage that would define his legacy and determine his fate. He was 41 years old when he first approached Western tourists on a Moscow street in August 1960, trying desperately to make contact with someone who would listen to what he knew. He was 44 when he was executed, having spent his final months in interrogation and imprisonment, knowing that he had been caught, that his operation had failed, that his family would suffer, and that he would not survive. And in between, he provided intelligence that helped prevent nuclear war. And he lost everything.